The most powerful bunker-busting bomb ever built by the United States weighs 30,000 pounds, costs roughly $3 million per unit, and can only be carried by the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. The Pentagon calls it the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator. Defense analysts call it the last resort. And for the better part of 2 decades, American war planners have pointed to it as the answer to one question. What do you do when your enemy moves their most dangerous weapons underground? Here is the problem, and I want you to understand this clearly before we go any further. The GBU-57 is officially rated to penetrate approximately 60 meters of earth. That is around 200 feet straight down. Iran's missile cities, the underground complexes where Tehran stores, produces, and launches its ballistic missile arsenal, are built at depths of 500 meters. 500. That is not a gap. That is not a challenge to be managed. That is a structural impossibility baked directly into the center of America's entire military strategy against Iran. And what makes this story extraordinary is not the gap itself. It is that Iran has been openly, publicly, almost mockingly telling the world about this gap for years. And in the aftermath of the 2025 and 2026 military campaigns, operations that the Trump administration described as decisive victories, United States intelligence assessed that Iran had recovered access to roughly 90% of its underground missile facilities. Not 10%, not half, 90%. So let's talk about what actually happened. And more importantly, let's talk about what is coming next. To understand how Iran built something that American airpower cannot reach, you have to go back to one of the most brutal and formative conflicts of the 20th century. The Iran-Iraq War, which ground on from 1980 to 1988, taught the Islamic Republic a lesson it has never forgotten. During those 8 years, Iran had no functional air force capable of defending its territory. Iraq bombed Iranian cities, Iranian oil infrastructure, Iranian military installations with near total impunity. Tehran watched helplessly as conventional air power proved decisive against a nation that had none of its own. The lesson Iran drew from that experience was not to build a better air force. The lesson was to make air power irrelevant. If your enemy controls the sky, you go underground. If your enemy has precision-guided munitions, you disperse. If your enemy can strike fixed locations, you build a network so vast and so distributed that destroying one node means nothing because 100 more are still operational. This is not improvisation. This is a doctrine born from 8 years of receiving bombs you cannot stop. The man who turned that doctrine into physical reality is Brigadier General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, commander of the IRGC Aerospace Force, the operational arm that controls Iran's entire ballistic missile program. Hajizadeh took command in 2009, and over the next decade and a half, he transformed Iran's missile infrastructure from a collection of above-ground facilities into something that no military in the world has ever built at this scale. In October 2015, Hajizadeh made the first public revelation of what Iran was constructing. He stood in front of cameras and took reporters on a tour of an underground missile base, tunnels carved into mountain rock, missiles on mobile launchers deep beneath the surface, fortified blast doors, lighting systems, command infrastructure. He called them missile cities. And then he said something that should have made every defense analyst in Washington stop what they were doing and pay very close attention. He said that Iran had built missile bases, quote, in all provinces and cities throughout the country at a depth of 500 meters. And then he added, almost as a challenge, if we have an unveiling of missile cities every week, it won't be finished for another 2 years. Think about what that means. Not one facility, not a handful of strategic sites. A dispersed, nationally distributed, underground production, storage, and launch network so large that revealing it one base at a time would take 2 years of weekly press conferences. Fast forward to March 26, 2025. The United States had issued a 2-month ultimatum to Tehran demanding Iran abandon its nuclear and missile programs. The pressure was real, the rhetoric was serious, and Iran's response was to publish a video. In it, Hajizadeh and Major General Mohammad Bagheri, Chief of Staff of Iran's armed forces, walked cameras through the 4th newly unveiled underground missile city of that year alone. 4 in a single year. The message was unmistakable. You are threatening to destroy what we have built, and what we have built is this. Come and find it. Behnam Ben Taleblu, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, put it plainly in his March 2025 analysis. He described Iran's strategy as designed, quote, to take the military option off the table for Israel, and by extension for the United States, through hardening, burying, and dispersing. Not defeating America in open combat. Not matching American airpower plane for plane, making the strike option structurally useless. But if you thought the depth problem was the whole story, what I'm about to tell you makes it significantly worse. Even when American and Israeli forces did strike Iran's missile infrastructure, and they struck it hard, they were overwhelmingly hitting the portion of the network that exists above ground. The industrial facilities, the production complexes. Sites like Kojir, Sharud, Hakimiyeh, and Parchin, what analysts at FDD described as the beating heart of Iran's ballistic missile industry. Satellite imagery of these sites shows expanded complexes with protective berms, hardened bunkers, blast separation construction. These are not soft targets, but they are targetable. They are visible. They exist within reach of munitions that American and Israeli aircraft can actually deliver. Rear Admiral. In the briefings following Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion, stated that Allied operations had damaged or destroyed over 85% of Iran's ballistic missile, drone, and naval defense industrial base. 85% sounds decisive. It sounds like a campaign that worked. But notice the specific language, industrial base, above-ground production capacity. What that number deliberately does not include is the underground network, the stored missiles, the dispersed launch infrastructure, the missile cities themselves. And here is the contrast that cuts through all of the press briefings. Lieutenant General James Adams, director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, testified before the House Armed Services Committee. His assessment did not match the victory narrative. He stated that despite significant degradation, Iran, quote, retains thousands of missiles and one-way attack UAVs capable of threatening U.S. and partner forces throughout the region. Thousands. After the most intensive Allied air campaign against Iran in history. Two senior American officials, two fundamentally incompatible pictures of the same war. So how does a country absorb weeks of sustained airstrikes and reconstitute its missile stockpile to near pre-war levels within months? The answer has two components, and both of them represent strategic failures that American planners have known about for years without solving either one. The first component is architecture. The missile cities are not simply deep holes in the ground. They are engineered systems. Iran has carved tunnel complexes into the granite and limestone of the Zagros Mountains, particularly in western provinces around Kermanshah and Loristan, where sites like the Konesh and Kenesht Canyon complex sit inside natural mountain terrain that provides both concealment and structural reinforcement. The Lar Missile Center in Fars province contains what Iranian state media describes as a vast tunnel network specifically designed around the principles of protection, concealment, and deception, not just hardening against blast, but making it genuinely difficult for satellite imagery to confirm what is operational and what is empty. The Hajiabad complex in Hormozgan province takes a different approach, hardened silos oriented directly toward Gulf targets, positioned for rapid launch with minimal exposure time. Different provinces, different geology, different construction methods, different orientations. The network is not uniform, it is adaptive, and at its deepest claim points, it is simply and physically beyond what the GBU-57 can reach. The math here is not ambiguous. The MOP's official penetration rating is around 60 meters in standard Earth conditions. In medium-strength rock, the kind of granite found in the Zagros, independent engineering calculations suggest actual penetration depth may be as low as 7 to 8 meters. Against a target 500 meters underground, that is not a near miss. That is not even in the same category of problem. The second component is supply. And this is where the story moves from Iran's mountains to Chinese shipping lanes, and where you start to understand why the regenerative part of this network is not a boast, it is an operational reality. The fuel that drives Iran's solid propellant ballistic missiles, the Fateh series, the Zulfagar, the K-bar Shakan, requires a chemical precursor called sodium perchlorate. Without it, you cannot manufacture solid rocket propellant. Without solid propellant, your most mobile and rapidly deployable missiles cannot be built. For years, Western intelligence tracked the quiet movement of sodium perchlorate from Chinese chemical producers to Iranian ports via IRIS-L, the Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines. Ships including the Golban, the Jairan, the Shabdis, and vessels operating under changed names and disabled AIS transponders to obscure their routes, running the China to Bandar Abbas corridor with chemical cargo declared under civilian trade manifests. In April 2025, the United States sanctioned 3 Chinese companies directly connected to these shipments: Shenzhen Amur Logistics, China Chlorate Tech, and Yanling Chuanxing Chemical Plant. And then the shipments continued. Because sanctions are not embargoes, and China's official position is that the trade constitutes, quote, normal commercial trade, not in violation of international law. Leaked documents obtained by Iran International linked a company called Haokun Energy, described as an IRGC oil intermediary, to procurement plans for 10,000 tons of sodium perchlorate. 10,000 tons. That quantity, analysts calculated, is sufficient to produce approximately 2,500 ballistic missiles. The financial infrastructure enabling these procurement networks runs through Bank Sepah, Iran's 4th largest state bank, which the U.S. Treasury has described as the financial linchpin of Iran's missile procurement network. Used to route payments for missile-related components acquired from Chinese and North Korean suppliers. Sanctioned for years. Still operational. This is the regenerative mechanism. You strike the production facilities, the underground storage survives. The supply chain, running through Chinese chemical companies, IRGC-linked shipping networks, and sanctioned banks that have found ways to function regardless, continues delivering the precursors. The Aerospace Industries Organization, operating through its 2 key subsidiaries, the Shahid Hemat Industrial Group for liquid-fueled systems and the Shahid Bagheri Industrial Group for solid-fueled systems, resumes production inside the surviving underground infrastructure. The AIO has formalized research partnerships with at least 22 Iranian universities for missile-related work. The institutional knowledge is distributed. The human capital is inside the country. The physical capital is underground, and the chemical inputs are flowing from the one country in the world that has both the industrial capacity to supply them and the geopolitical will to ignore American objections. The 2025 and 2026 campaigns field-tested this entire theory under real conditions. Operation Rising Lion, the Israeli campaign, and the subsequent American Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion together represented the most sustained Allied military effort against Iranian military infrastructure since the Islamic Republic was founded. American B-2 bombers, the only aircraft capable of carrying the GBU-57, used a significant portion of the total U.S. MOP inventory, estimated at around 20 bombs, against the Fordo nuclear enrichment facility in June 2025. The strikes on Fordo were real, the damage was real, but Fordo is a nuclear site, not a missile production hub, and the underground missile network that Hajizadeh spent 15 years building was not Fordo. It was 500 meters down in the Zagros Mountains and in hardened complexes in Hormozgan and Fars and Kermanshah and a dozen other provinces that American and Israeli aircraft struck the surface of, while the operational infrastructure below continued to function. The U.S. intelligence assessment released after the campaign stated clearly, Iran regained access to roughly 90% of its underground missile facilities. Within months, stockpile levels had returned to near pre-war baselines. Mark Canchin and Chris Park, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, published what became the definitive assessment of what those campaigns cost the United States in munitions expenditure. The numbers documented a rate of consumption that raised serious questions about the sustainability of sustained high-intensity operations. You are spending precision munitions at a rate that strains industrial production capacity, targeting a network that can absorb those strikes and reconstitute because the underground infrastructure survives and the supply chain keeps running. The cost asymmetry is not a footnote. It is the central strategic fact of this entire problem. Iran builds a ballistic missile, depending on the system, at a cost measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The United States deploys munitions to intercept or destroy that missile at costs measured in millions. The GBU-57 costs roughly $3 million per bomb. The B-2 sorties required to deliver them cost considerably more. And you are running that cost equation against a country that has pre-positioned its most critical assets 500 meters underground, backed by Chinese chemical supply chains and 22 university research partnerships, and a doctrine built over 40 years specifically designed to make your most expensive weapons irrelevant. The program's founder did not survive to see how thoroughly his architecture proved its critics wrong. Hassan Tehrani Moghadam, the IRGC officer universally described as the father of Iran's missile program, was killed on November 12, 2011, in an explosion at the Shahid Modares Garrison Missile Research Facility near Bidgane. The explosion was widely attributed to a propellant handling accident. His death was a genuine setback. The program did not pause. The research and self-sufficiency jihad organization he built, the RSSJO, continued under successors who had been trained inside the institutional framework he created. The missile program's continuity through his death tells you something important about how Iran designed this capability. It is not dependent on a single genius or a single facility or a single supply route. It is institutional. It is distributed. It is by design survivable. So where does this leave the United States? And what does it actually mean when American officials stand in front of cameras and declare that Iran's missile capabilities have been decimated? It means they are describing a real thing: the above-ground industrial footprint, the visible production facilities, the surface infrastructure that satellites can map and aircraft can strike, while carefully not describing the other thing, the thing that is 500 meters underground, the thing that required no electricity from the surface grid to keep functioning. The thing that was designed from its inception to absorb exactly the kind of campaign that was just run against it and emerge with 90% of its operational capacity intact. The DIA's Lieutenant General Adams said it without ambiguity: thousands of missiles remain. The victory is real on the metrics that were easy to measure and easy to hit. The problem is also real on the metrics that were hardest to reach and impossible to fully destroy. Hajizadeh said it himself, years before any of this came to a head: if we have an unveiling of missile cities every week, it won't be finished for another 2 years. He was not speaking to the Iranian public. He was speaking to any analyst paying attention. He was saying, we have built more of this than you know, deeper than your weapons can reach, dispersed across a geography too wide for any targeting list to fully cover. And the test of that claim, the real-world operational test that no war game or simulation could fully replicate, has now been run. The results are not classified. The DIA director delivered them to Congress under oath. Iran retained 90% of its underground missile facilities after the most intensive Allied air campaign in the history of the conflict. The regenerative network is not a future capability. It already demonstrated what it can do. The fatal flaw in America's plan to destroy Iran's missile cities is not a planning failure or an intelligence gap or a technology problem waiting to be solved by the next generation of bunker busters. It is a structural reality baked into the physics of how deep underground these facilities were built, sustained by a supply chain running through China that American sanctions have not stopped, and validated by a campaign that cost the United States billions of dollars in munitions while leaving Iran's most survivable assets intact. The next question, and it is the one that every serious strategist in Washington is now wrestling with, is what you do when the military option doesn't work the way the briefings said it would. That question does not have a clean answer. But it starts with being honest about what the numbers that are easy to measure are hiding about the things that are not.